Would you stand up to defend a veteran when he's treated unfairly? This is the story of how a young man turned a bustling train station into the birthplace of a movement. At O'Hare, the busy terminal buzzed with voices and rolling luggage. By gate D17, Michael sat in his wheelchair, his Semper Fi cap pulled low. Beside him, his service dog Charlie, a yellow Labrador, sat alert, his vest snug around his frame. Michael's hand gripped the armrests, his anxiety palpable in the crowded space. Flight 485 to Miami is now boarding at gate D15, the intercom crackled. Michael's steel-grey eyes scanned the crowd, his discomfort evident as a college student bumped into his chair, unaware. "Excuse me," Michael muttered, but the student was already gone. A woman approached with her daughter, who stared at Charlie. "Is he a helper dog?" the girl asked. Michael smiled faintly. "He sure is. Charlie's my partner. He helps me get around." The girl asked to pet Charlie, and after receiving permission, she giggled as Charlie's tail wagged. Soon, Michael approached the gate agent with his paperwork, but as she scanned his documents, her smile faded. Sir, there's an issue with your service animal," she said, her voice lowered. "What issue?" Michael asked, his heart racing. "A new policy. Certain animals aren't allowed on board." Michael's pulse quickened. "He's a registered service dog. I have the paperwork." The agent hesitated. "It's protocol." Michael's voice tightened. "Charlie isn't just a dog. He's the reason I'm here." The crowd murmured as the tension grew. "What do you mean, not allowed?" Michael demanded. The agent faltered. "Some animals, even service animals, might not meet updated requirements." "I've got the paperwork. This isn't optional," Michael replied, his calm voice hiding simmering anger. A few passengers paused nearby, intrigued by the tension in Michael's voice. A man in a suit with a Bluetooth headset folded his arms, while a young mother with a toddler glanced over, brows furrowed. The agent's polite smile tightened. "I understand, sir, but I don't make the policies. Would you like me to call my supervisor?" "I'd like to know how this policy overrides federal law," Michael interrupted, his voice cutting. His gaze flicked to Charlie, who shifted closer, pressing against his leg, grounding him. Michael gripped the dog's collar for support. The agent hesitated, glancing nervously at the growing line behind him. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "This doesn't seem right," someone muttered. "Isn't it illegal to deny a service dog?" a man whispered, his phone already in hand. Michael didn't look back. His focus remained on the agent, now speaking into her headset. "I'm not trying to cause trouble," Michael said, his tone deliberate. "But I've been through this before. The law is clear. And Charlie..." He glanced down at his dog, softening for a moment. "Charlie is the reason I'm even here." The agent nodded, quickly, typing on her tablet. "I understand, Mr. Price. It's just that..." "You don't understand," Michael cut in, his voice firmer now. "You don't know what it's like to walk into a room and feel the walls closing in, to not trust your own body. Charlie does. That's his job. That's why he's here." The air thickened, more passengers drawn to the scene. The man in the suit stepped closer, his expression shifting to something more critical. And the mother whispered to her child. Michael glanced at the growing crowd, his jaw tight. He didn't want to be a spectacle, but the agent's hesitation made it clear this wasn't going to end quietly. "I served this country," Michael said, his voice rising to carry to the onlookers. "And now you're telling me I can't board because of a policy you can't even explain." The murmurs grew. A teenager began recording. The man in the suit shook his head, lips pressed thin. The agent, visibly flustered, glanced at another agent nearby. "I'm escalating this," she said, her voice betraying her nerves. Michael leaned back slightly, loosening his grip on Charlie's collar. The dog nudged his leg again. Michael exhaled slowly, frustration still sharp but contained. "Good," he said simply. "Do that." Behind him, the crowd's murmurs turned into a low rumble, the tension thickening at gate D17. Michael didn't look back but could feel it. Something was shifting, and he didn't know if it would work in his favor or consume him. Michael sat in his wheelchair, hand resting on Charlie's back as the rising pulse in his chest matched the steady rhythm of the dog's breathing. The gate agent stepped away to speak quickly into her headset, her voice low and tense. Moments later, a tall man in a pressed shirt and blue tie approached, his name badge reading L. Dawson, supervisor. "Mr. Price, I'm Logan Dawson, the gate supervisor," he said, crouching slightly. "I've been briefed on the situation. First, let me say we appreciate your service." Michael cut him off, voice firm. "Let's skip the part where you thank me for my service and tell me I can't board." Dawson paused, momentarily thrown off. "It's not about denying access, sir. It's about adhering to updated airline protocols for service animals. These policies ensure the safety and comfort of all passengers." "Comfort?" Michael repeated dryly. "You think I bring him for fun? This isn't a choice." Dawson cleared his throat. "I'm not questioning your needs, sir, but our policy... Charlie's certified. You want to see the papers again?" The crowd murmured in the background, a man in a baseball cap muttering, "This is no way to treat a veteran." A young woman with a toddler added, "He's got the papers. What else do they want?" Michael's voice cut through the noise. "I'm not asking for favors. Charlie's the reason I can be here without losing my mind in a place like this." He adjusted his sleeve, revealing a faded eagle tattoo, then added quietly, "If you want to know what it took from me, let's start with my legs, then my nights and every shred of peace I had." He met Dawson's eyes. "Charlie gives me a fraction of that peace, so no, I'm not leaving him behind." The crowd pressed closer, voices growing louder. A man in a suit raised his phone, asking, "Isn't denying a service dog illegal?" Dawson shot him a glance. "Please refrain from recording." "Why?" the man shot back. "So you can keep doing this without anyone noticing." The murmurs turned into a rumble. A woman with a carry-on bag spoke up. "That man served our country. Now you're giving him grief over a dog?" Michael felt the weight of the crowd's attention. Charlie's steady presence grounded him, and he sat up straighter, his voice cutting through the rising din. "This isn't about me. This is about every veteran, every disabled person treated like an inconvenience. If you want to follow your policies, fine. But understand this. You're telling people like me we don't belong." The crowd murmured in agreement, and even Dawson faltered, his composure slipping under Michael's conviction. For the first time, Michael felt hope, a shift in the air as collective indignation grew around him. The crowd murmured louder as a calm voice cut through the tension. "Excuse me," the voice said, clear and deliberate. Heads turned to find Barron Trump standing near the gate. He was alone, dressed simply, his ticket in hand, yet his presence commanded attention. Dawson, the gate supervisor, froze mid-sentence, his rehearsed words faltering. "What seems to be the issue here?" Barron asked, his tone polite but sharp. Michael watched, wary but curious. Dawson hesitated before speaking. "This gentleman's service dog doesn't meet the updated requirements for boarding," he said, his voice faltering. Barron raised an eyebrow. "This man is a veteran. That's a service dog. What's unclear?" Dawson stumbled over his words. "We're enforcing airline policy, which..." "Policy?" Barron interrupted. "Does it override federal law? The ADA protects service animals, including on planes," the crowd murmured in agreement, gaining confidence as Barron spoke. "Exactly," someone called out. That's the law, another added. Dawson shifted uncomfortably. We're just ensuring safety and comfort for all passengers, he said, his voice wavering. Barron's voice remained calm but cutting. Tell me, has Charlie posed a safety risk? He's sitting quietly, doing his job. Unlike this situation. Dawson opened his mouth, but Barron continued. This isn't about following protocol. It's about doing what's right. Do you really want to defend denying this man the assistance he needs? Michael leaned back slightly, his grip on Charlie loosening. He couldn't help but respect Barron's sharp logic and calm authority. Barron addressed the crowd. This is about more than one person. It's about rules that should serve us, not control us. A man in the crowd nodded. He's right, this is nonsense. The mother with the toddler spoke up. He's a Marine. He deserves better than this. The crowd's energy shifted. They now stood behind Michael and Charlie. Barron turned to Dawson, his tone soft but firm. I suggest that you call someone higher up. If you don't, this story will go public, and people will care. Dawson, visibly deflated, nodded. I'll make a call. Barron stepped back, then turned to Michael, offering his hand. Thank you for your service. Michael stared for a moment, then shook his hand. Didn't expect someone like you in my corner. Barron shrugged. It's the right thing to do. Michael smiled faintly, and Charlie gave a small wag of approval. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder as phones appeared, recording the scene. This is unbelievable, a man muttered, holding up his phone. How is this happening in 2025? A teenager angled his phone at the scene. This needs to go viral. A woman with a stroller pushed forward. Why isn't this settled yet? She demanded. He's a veteran, and that's a service dog. What more do they need? Michael shifted in his wheelchair, instinctively reaching for Charlie's collar. Beneath his calm exterior, his chest tightened, but he spoke quietly. I didn't think anyone would care. For so long, it felt like I'd been invisible, like no one saw me or what it's like to just get through the day. The crowd fell silent, listening intently. Even the teenager lowered his phone, sensing the weight of the moment. Barron stepped forward, kneeling to meet Michael's gaze. You're not invisible, Michael, he said firmly. Not here, not today. Michael lifted his head, meeting Barron's unwavering eyes. Barron added, Look around you. Michael's eyes scanned the crowd, faces filled with solidarity, not pity. The man in the baseball cap nodded. The woman with the stroller smiled faintly, her child resting on her shoulder. Even the man in the suit had moved closer, arms crossed in quiet support. This isn't just about a flight, Barron continued. It's about showing people they matter, that their struggles aren't dismissed. You, Michael, matter. Michael swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper. Thank you. Charlie nudged his leg, grounding him in the moment. The crowd, emboldened by Barron's words, grew more vocal. This is wrong, a man shouted. Get him and his dog on that plane. You're making a mistake, another added, and we're all here to make sure everyone knows it, Dawson returned, visibly rattled. We're working on resolving this, he stammered. Work faster, the woman with the stroller snapped. Barron's voice was calm but firm. You heard them. This isn't going away, and neither are we. As the crowd's collective power aligned with Michael's, he sat straighter, his fingers resting lightly on Charlie's vest. For the first time in years, he didn't feel invisible. He felt seen. And maybe, just maybe, change was possible. Logan Dawson, the gate supervisor, stood near the counter, nervously clutching his clipboard as he spoke into his headset. Yes, we've got a situation, he muttered, glancing at the growing crowd at gate D17. His voice was tight, and he nodded in response to someone on the other end. No, sir. It's escalating. I'd recommend... Yes, immediately. The murmurs in the crowd had escalated into anger. Passengers were growing impatient. This is taking too long, one man muttered. They've had enough time to figure this out. You'd think a major airline could handle something like this, a woman added. Barron Trump stepped forward, commanding the crowd's attention with calm authority. He raised his hand. Let's stay focused. This isn't about shouting louder. It's about making sure they hear us. The crowd exhaled collectively, and the tension eased slightly, though frustration remained. Michael, watching Barron with a mix of skepticism and awe, found his own voice. Shifting in his wheelchair, he faced Dawson and spoke with rising conviction. This isn't just about me, he said firmly. This is about every veteran who gets told they're too much trouble. Every person with a disability who has to fight for basic respect. You think I'm the first? I'm not. And I won't be the last unless something changes. Dawson hesitated, his fingers gripping his headset tighter, but Michael continued. I gave this country everything I had. My legs, my peace of mind. And now you're telling me the one thing that helps me function doesn't meet your requirements. You've got some nerve. The crowd murmured in agreement, shifting from anger to solidarity. Barron stepped closer to Michael, his voice calm but firm. He's right. This isn't about policy, it's about people. Policies can change. People like Michael shouldn't have to suffer while they catch up. Dawson opened his mouth to respond, but Barron cut him off. If you want to save face, call whoever you need to call. Get Michael and Charlie on that plane, and when this is over, go back to your management and tell them to take a hard look at their policies. Visibly flustered, Dawson stammered, I'll escalate this further, before retreating to a side office. The crowd buzzed with quiet conversations as Michael exhaled, his grip tightening on the wheelchair. He glanced at Barron. You're not bad at this, he muttered. Barron shrugged. You learn to speak up when it matters. Michael nodded, his voice growing louder. This is bigger than me. It's about every veteran and disabled person who's ever been made to feel like their needs are an inconvenience. This has to stop, because if we don't fight back, nothing changes. The crowd responded with murmurs of agreement and encouragement. Barron looked at Michael. They're listening, and so is the airline. They'll make it right. As Dawson re-emerged from the office, the room held its breath, waiting for the next move. Logan Dawson stepped out of the side office, his face tense. After speaking with upper management, we've decided to allow Mr. Price and his service dog, Charlie, to board the flight, he announced to the crowd at gate D17. Applause erupted, and Michael, seated in his wheelchair, raised a hand for silence. Thank you, he said. But this isn't just about me. It's about everyone who's ever been made to feel they don't belong. The crowd fell silent, listening. This fight doesn't end here, Michael continued. There will always be another gate, another policy telling someone like me we're not enough. We need to keep speaking up and showing up. Barron stepped forward. What happened here isn't just a mistake. It's a broken system, he said. We need to hold them accountable. A woman nodded. We'll make sure they hear about this, she said, and Barron agreed. This is about setting a standard. Michael turned to Barron with gratitude. You didn't have to step in, but you did. That matters. Barron shrugged. Sometimes doing the right thing is obvious. Dawson approached, apologizing for the inconvenience. Michael met his gaze. Make sure this doesn't happen again. That's how you can apologize. As the crowd dispersed, Michael and Charlie moved to the boarding area. Michael looked back, exchanging a nod with Barron. As he boarded the plane, the terminal felt different, no longer just a waiting place, but a reminder of what could happen when people stood together. On the plane, Michael settled into his seat, Charlie at his feet. The applause from the gate still echoed in his mind. This wasn't about winning. It was about being seen. The voices from the gate replayed, "Why isn't this settled? This needs to go viral." Strangers had stood with him, giving him a voice he hadn't realized he still had. "We did it, buddy," Michael whispered to Charlie. Barron entered the cabin, exchanged a few words with the flight attendant, and sat a few rows behind Michael. Michael nodded at him. "Guess they listened." Barron stopped. "They did. But that was all of us." Michael smiled faintly. Still, not many would have stepped in like that. Barron shrugged. Sometimes the right thing doesn't need much thought. The flight attendant thanked Barron for his help. "That was really something," she said. Barron smiled, brushing it off. "We all did this." The energy at gate D17 lingered as passengers discussed the incident. One woman remarked, "I can't believe it took all of that to get him on the plane." Another man commented, "Barron handled it like a pro," still filming the aftermath. The video spread online with hashtags like "Respect Our Veterans," "Service Dogs Matter" trending. As the final boarding call sounded and the cabin doors closed, Michael felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. The terminal lights blurred into the distance as the plane took off. For the first time in a long time, he felt seen, not just as a veteran or a man in a wheelchair, but as a person whose struggles had been acknowledged. The plane landed, and Michael glanced at Charlie, who stirred. "We're here, buddy," he whispered. Once the aisle cleared, Michael maneuvered his wheelchair, Charlie by his side. Barron gave him a small nod as their eyes met. At the plane's exit, Michael paused. "I didn't expect someone like you to step in," he said to Barron. Barron shrugged. It was the right thing to do. They exchanged a firm handshake, and Michael thanked him. Barron responded, "Thank you for everything you've done." Michael checked his phone, overwhelmed by a flood of messages. The video had gone viral, and the comments poured in. Strangers shared their own stories of support, and Michael felt emotional reading them. In the terminal, Michael noticed Charlie's wagging tail. "We're not invisible anymore, are we, boy?" he whispered, posting a message thanking everyone who had stood with him. As he left the terminal, he felt lighter, finally feeling seen and valued. At the end of the story, a profound message resonates. We do not need strength or power to create change, just the courage to stand up when it is truly necessary. The small act of a young man, along with the support of strangers at the airport, not only helped a veteran, but also sparked a movement to advocate for those who need to be heard. It reminds all of us that kindness and righteous actions always spread, and that small steps can create a greater impact than we think. If this story touches your heart, please share your feelings in the comments. Have you ever witnessed or participated in a moment of standing up for what is right? We would love to hear your story. Don't forget to hit like to support this positive message, share the video to spread the story to more people, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next inspiring stories. Together, we can create a better world, starting with the smallest actions.